Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Fueling the Future Scaling Low Carbon Drop-in Fuels in BC webinar. We are thrilled to have you here today. My name is Ashley Callister, Investment Lead at NorthX Climate Tech, and I'll be hosting today's session. NorthX is grateful to operate on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We recognize the leadership of Indigenous peoples and rights holders across the drop-in fuels value chain and are committed to learning from Indigenous communities and supporting their priorities and potential roles in drop-in fuel development across BC and beyond. So before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available on our website shortly after today's session. We'll have dedicated time for Q&A at the end of the session, but you're welcome to submit your questions at any time using the Q&A function. You'll find it in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can. You'll also notice a few interactive polls throughout, so we'd love your participation when those come up. And to kick things off, we're curious to know where you're tuning in from today. So we'll give it about 30 seconds, but please let us know. Okay, so it looks like we've got quite a mix, majority from BC, but great to see some folks outside of BC, some international, even some kind of diverse range there. So while this is a BC-based study, the learnings for drop-in fuel development are applicable far beyond our borders. So we really appreciate you taking the time to tune in today. We're going to start with a brief overview of both organizations, and then we will dive right into the report. NorthX Climate Tech is an independent, not-for-profit organization founded in 2021 to empower climate tech innovators to build a world-leading sector in Canada. So our goal is to drive both economic prosperity and decarbonization. We are a $105 million fund supported by both public and private partners, deploying capital into a growing portfolio of companies commercializing climate hard tech solutions. Our 52 million in investments have catalyzed over 610 million in total, helping to create more than 800 jobs, and they're on track to contribute up to 46 megatons per year of GHG abatement by 2035. So here's a quick snapshot of our current portfolio. So you can see we support a wide range of companies, and we'll actually be adding to the roster through an announcement of industrial hard tech innovators later this month. So stay tuned for that. What makes NorthX distinct is our integrated approach. So we don't just write checks, we convene industries and use data-backed insights to define investment thesis. We then identify key pain points, we surface opportunities for innovation. Sometimes this means producing intelligence reports to create continuity in fragmented sectors. We then provide non-dilutive funding to get the best ideas to scale. And drop-in fuel sits right at the center of that thesis. So hard-to-abate sectors such as aviation and marine can't wait for infrastructure to catch up. They need solutions that work today with the assets that they already have. That's why we commissioned this report with the Transition Accelerator. It builds on previous work completed by NorthX and provides a rigorous, independent analysis of BC's real opportunity in this space. This report actually now serves as the most comprehensive and up-to-date analysis of the drop-in fuel value chain in BC. The structure consists of a main report and two supporting technical briefs, progressing from market potential and techno-economic feasibility to a practical scale-up framework. Together, they quantify BC's demand and feedstock availability, they evaluate the most viable production pathways, and outline the infrastructure, policy, and financial enablers needed to get from first-of-a-kind projects to commercial scale. In addition to our gratitude to the Transition Accelerator, we'd also like to thank the University of Alberta, the University of Calgary, and the Province of British Columbia for their support on this project, along with the outstanding advisory council and the stakeholders engaged across 3 industry workshops, which really rooted this study in reality. So that brings me to today's speakers. I'm now going to hand things over to the team behind the report to walk you through the key findings. Dr. David Layzell, FRSC, is an emeritus professor at the University of Calgary, Director of Canadian Energy Systems and Analysis Research Initiative, as well as co-founder and principal of the Transition Accelerator. Joining him is Nathan Curry, Biostrategy Lead at the Transition Accelerator. So Nathan, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ashley. I'm just going to introduce the Transition Accelerator for those of you who don't know. So, the Transition Accelerator is a pan-Canadian nonprofit that equips leaders in industry, government, and civil society with the strategic insights and rigorous analytics needed to win in the global energy transition. Working with over 300 partners, we help build out pathways to a prosperous low carbon economy while avoiding costly dead ends along the way. We use our core initiatives, shown on the slide here, to bring together stakeholders in industry, government, indigenous communities, and civil society to help advance real solutions in the highest priority sectors. Our knowledge mobilization efforts involve things like courses and webinars like this one to promote a better understanding of how system transitions work in practice and how to approach them strategically. Now, while I pass it over to Dr. David Layzell to explain the context of the study, we have another poll that should pop up where you can tell us a bit about why are you here today?
Amazing. So it looks like we've got a pretty wide range of why people are here, and that's really why we brought the leads in to chat more about each and every one of the findings. So hopefully that gives them a little more context to answer your questions. But if there's anything specific, feel free to put it in the Q&A. David, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ashley. Um, what I'd like to do is start by just commenting. The reason we're here, of course, is because the world and Canada has a greenhouse gas problem. It's about our greenhouse gas emitters, our climate change challenges that greenhouse gas emissions have caused. What's showing on the left side of this diagram here are the emissions in British Columbia over the last almost 25 years. And you can notice that emissions have stabilized in British Columbia. That doesn't, given all the efforts British Columbia has put in to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, one might say this doesn't look very impressive, but you have to remember that the population in British Columbia has increased over 33% over this same period. So this has shown a significant per capita reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over this period. However, there's a long way to go in order to achieve the net zero commitments that Canada and British Columbia have made by mid-century. And what I'd like to do is to focus on the blue part of this chart here, which is the largest component of greenhouse gas emissions is actually associated with the end use combustion of a number of energy carriers, fossil carbon-based energy carriers. This is the sport by end use. We're talking about transportation, we're talking about buildings and non-energy producing industries. And over 60% of the emissions in British Columbia is associated with those sectors. In addition, there's another almost 20% or so 25% is associated with the production of those energy carriers. So clearly, if we're going to address climate change, we need to address the end-use energy carriers in our energy systems today. These are pretty amazing energy carriers. There's four of them that really dominate. Natural gas, jet fuel, gasoline, and diesel, and the relative proportions of these are shown here. And some of the details about these energy carriers show why they're so incredibly valuable in driving the energy systems of the last 100 years or so. And they have very high energy content. You can see here megajoules per kilogram range from 45 to 54 megajoules per kilogram. Even on volumetric density, liquid fuels are high. Of course, gaseous fuels are low. This is at atmospheric pressure, but you can compress natural gas to get higher energy contents per unit volume. But the other thing to note about these is they're all carbon-based. And they have reasonably high carbon contents. Natural gas is lowest at around 14 grams of carbon per every megajoule, about 18 and a half or 18 up to 18.9 for the liquid fuels. So I think if we're going to have a net zero strategy, we really need to look at ways to replace these energy carriers and conversion technologies that they use in order to deliver our energy services with energy carriers and conversion technologies that don't generate greenhouse gases when they are consumed or combusted. There's three possibilities that really are the focus of most net zero transitions. The first is electrification, and obviously that often requires changing the conversion technology, going from gasoline engine, gasoline vehicle to an electric vehicle, or going from a natural gas furnace to a heat pump. Hydrogen is another possibility where, because when you consume hydrogen, you don't produce any greenhouse gases, and it can be used with a fuel cell or in new furnaces, etc. And the third one, and the one that's really the focus of today's presentation, is drop-in fuels. And these are essentially hydrocarbons that are of very chemical compositions that are identical or very similar to the chemical compositions that we have above, showing for traditional fossil fuels. However, the combustion of these does not increase atmospheric CO2, and that's really what makes them different. So then we can ask the question, well, what is the potential demand for drop-in fuels for these fuels in British Columbia in mid-century, by 2050? And the calculations that we did in this study was to project the status quo for British Columbia. What is the status quo energy future to 2050, assuming that the population will continue to grow from more or less 5.4 million in 2023 to, we projected, to 6.8 million in 2050. We've also extended but dampened the energy efficiency improvements, the considerable energy efficiency improvements that have been achieved in the past, because assuming that we're using the same energy carriers and conversion technologies, it is limited amount of improvements that one can make. And then we added in each sector, we went through each sector of the end use sectors and analyzed the potential role for electrification, seeing that electrification is probably the lowest hanging, the easiest solution. And rather than assigning any energy to hydrogen versus DI, we said all the rest of the emissions and the fuels that need to be replaced could be replaced by drop-in fuels. Essentially, we do not have a role for direct use of hydrogen as an end-use carrier in this particular model. The results we got are summarized here. This is for end-use demand for a net zero British Columbia in 2050. The bottom two of the bar chart here are really the existing non-energy emitting uses in the energy system of British Columbia today, but projected through to 2050, just with population growth. The next part is more electricity, and this is the new electricity demands, mostly electric vehicles and heat pumps, but also electricity use in some industries where it really makes sense. In deploying that electricity, one finds that you can actually get significant efficiency savings over the status quo, and that's shown in the box at the top. So what's in between this is the calculation of the potential demand for drop-in fuels as either liquid drop-in fuels, replacing things like gasoline, diesel, or jet fuel, or natural gas as a renewable natural gas, essentially, in areas like buildings and industry. The sum total for our estimate for 2050 for British Columbia is the maximum estimated drop-in fuel demand would be about 422 petajoules per year. And that is equivalent, if you look at these as being the hydrocarbons, a similar hydrocarbon composition to what we have is in our energy system today. That's about 7.4 million tons of elemental carbon per year. And most of it, we see the biggest demand would be in the liquid fuels, less in the gaseous fuels. I think it's really important here to recognize that if you're going to be making a drop-in fuel in order to address climate change, you've really got to follow very closely the source of the carbon, because we know that these fuels are going to be combusted and going out the tailpipes of cars or the chimneys of buildings, etc. And so the carbon is going to be entering the atmosphere. So the question we ask then is, where could BC access at least 7.4 million tons of carbon that would not be a greenhouse gas when it is released to the atmosphere as CO2? And to put that number 7.4 million tons in perspective, the annual roundwood harvest in British Columbia is about 8.8 million tons of carbon. So we're talking a lot of carbon here that would need to be found. So the question is, where do we get that carbon? Where can we find that carbon? And Um, we've did an analysis and looked at a lot of different sources of carbon in British Columbia that theoretically could be used to make drop-in fuels. And we show here on the right side the target number. We were looking for a drop-in fuel demand of 7.4 million tons of carbon. You can see it on the right here. And in theory, we went and looked at possible sources. And some of the examples of the sources are shown here. One was very large industrial targeted sources of bio-based flue gas. So this could be say a biomass power plant where carbon dioxide is going up the chimney, and one could capture that carbon and bring it and use it to make into a drop-in fuel. Others are the large amount of carbon that's in fire-killed trees or in insect-killed trees, and these are really the big bar charts here. Unused annual allowable cut in the province, forest floor residues that are associated with the existing forest harvest system, forest slash, which is currently combusted and burnt in BC forestry systems, or even wood pellets that are currently packaged up and typically sent to Europe. And we said, well, if we really had a drop-in fuel market, maybe divert that biomass and use it for making drop-in fuels in British Columbia. All of the agricultural ones and municipal waste streams are a little bit at the bottom here. So you can see not nearly as important as the forestry-based, not surprising in British Columbia. We took those numbers then and we discounted them. The numbers came up to about 64, 65 million tons of carbon, almost about 9 times the drop in fuel demand. But we thought a lot of these are really not going to be accessible because of their location and challenges of harvesting them, etc. So we dropped that and we had an analysis that took it down to about 23 million tons. But even when we looked at that 23 million tons of carbon per year that could be accessible, we concluded that not all this biomass could actually be diverted to drop-in fuels, and where you didn't get a global warming forcing, where we had to assume that the global warming potential was very close to zero of all that carbon. And examples of this are that in, say, forest residues, or certainly in these insect or fire-killed trees, if you just left the biomass on the forest floor, studies have shown that even in British Columbia, that it only decays at about 1 to 2% per year. So if that biomass were diverted into become a drop-in fuel, that carbon would be in the atmosphere within a year. Part of it in the atmosphere in the process of making the biofuel are the drop-in fuel, and some of it when you actually combust that drop-in fuel in a vehicle or in a home. And then the other example here is in landfills. We know that lignocellulosic biomass can only lose, maybe even 10% carbon over 100 years. So certainly landfills are challenging it may be better to leave the carbon in a landfill than divert it away from a landfill. And certainly many of the larger stocks we see here are analysis from other studies that the global warming potential for these is certainly not zero. It's somewhere often in the range of 0.3 to 0.6 or even higher. So what we ended up doing in this study is we wanted to avoid biomass sources that had a global warming potential estimate of anything above about 0.1. And that decreased our overall calculation of the amount of drop-in fuel potential at around 9.6 million tons of carbon, just a little bit more than the diff demand of the 7.4 million tons of carbon. And the calculated energy that was embedded in this biomass is about 386 petajoules of chemical energy. And so that's where we then handed it over for the techno-economic analysis that you're going to be hearing about now back to Nathan. So Nathan, back to you.
All right, thank you very much, David. So next slide, please. Now that we've established that BC may need up to 422 petajoules of drop-in fuels by 2050, even with strong efforts to electrify everything possible across sectors, we can translate that to about 8 billion liters of liquid drop-in fuels, which would be 3 billion liters of sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, 3.6 billion liters of renewable diesel, and about 0.7 billion liters of renewable gasoline, and also about 3 billion meters cubed of renewable gases. We've also established that the main carbon resource that could be used to produce these low carbon drop-in fuels is forest biomass, specifically forest residues. We can now look at the different ways in which we could produce these fuels at scale in BC. So in this study, we investigated 4 different conversion pathways and 8 different scenarios for producing drop-in fuels in BC, mainly from forest residues, but also from CO2, from bioflue gas, or captured atmospheric CO2. So there are 5 liquid fuel scenarios that we investigated and 3 gaseous fuel scenarios. For conversion of biomass into liquid fuels, or advanced biofuel pathways, we looked at gasification plus Fischer-Tropsch, or what is referred to as the biomass to liquids, or BTL pathway. For the conversion of biomass into renewable natural gas, we looked at the gasification plus methanation pathway. For the conversion of CO2 plus hydrogen into liquid fuels, we looked at reverse water gas shift plus Fischer-Tropsch pathway, which is often referred to as an e-fuels or power to liquids pathway. So both the BTL and the PTL pathways convert a syngas into liquid fuels in the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis process, and the only difference is where you're sourcing the carbon and the hydrogen for your syngas. To convert CO2 and hydrogen into a synthetic low carbon natural gas replacement, often called SNG instead of RNG, we looked at the Sabatier process. If you're not familiar with this process, it was used successfully on the International Space Station for 6 years as part of their environmental control and life support system. There have been multiple pilot scale demonstrations of this technology to make SNG in Europe, and even a small project at the University of British Columbia. So the detailed techno-economics of all of these pathways can be found in the supporting document, Technical Brief B. The technology readiness levels, or TRLs, shown here are a combination of literature review and the results of polling that we did of industry experts in the project workshops, kind of contextualizing the TRL for BC versus just in general globally. So the takeaway here is that the lowest cost and highest TRL pathway was the biomass to liquids pathway, coming in at around 2 to 3 times the wholesale cost of diesel. Of course, this pricing was from over a year ago now, and the current rack prices in Vancouver for ultra low sulfur diesel are sitting around $2 a liter. I think I just checked earlier today, which is close to parity with the production costs that we calculated for producing renewable diesel from this pathway in BC. The gasification plus methanation RNG pathway came out to be just under $40 per gigajoule, which is more than the maximum acquisition price that the gas utility FortisBC is allowed to pay for RNG by a few dollars, but it's fairly close. The synthetic fuel pathways are lower TRL and much more expensive, as carbon capture and low carbon hydrogen generation are emerging and expensive processes by themselves, and they need to be integrated with other complicated and expensive processes. Okay, next slide, please. So to zoom in a bit more on the biomass to liquids pathway, which seems to be the most promising pathway to produce low carbon drop-in fuels in BC, we actually looked at 3 different scenarios. And there's an interesting and perhaps surprising result here. If you add an external input to the process, namely hydrogen, you can actually make the process cheaper. But why is this? Well, the reason is slightly technical, but it's important to understand. When you gasify biomass and produce syngas, it typically has a hydrogen to carbon monoxide ratio of 1 to 1. In order to efficiently produce fuel from the syngas in the FT reactor, it needs about a 2 to 1 ratio of hydrogen to carbon monoxide. So you have 2 options. 1, you can either add new hydrogen to get that ratio, or 2, you can discard about half of the carbon coming from your biomass. But if you're dealing with a limited and potentially costly input feedstock like biomass residues, you likely want to maximize the carbon efficiency of your process so that you get as much throughput as possible from each unit of biomass that you put in. So in the study, we looked at a biomass to liquid system with no H2 added, one with blue H2 and green H2 added at costs of $3 and $6 per gigajoule respectively. As you can see on the table, pathway B, where you add external blue H2 to the process, is actually cheaper from a dollars per liter of output perspective because of the 1.6x boost in carbon efficiency that you get. Next slide. So we established that the scenario B, converting biomass to drop-in fuels using blue H2 could be the most cost-effective pathway. The question is, with a limited amount of forest residues, where does it make the most sense to direct these resources if we want to maximize our impact on emissions by 2050? Well, due to the lack of other decarbonization options for aviation, we suggest that we may want to prioritize sustainable aviation fuel or SAF production with these residues, and in doing so, could meet 1 billion liters a year, or about 35% of jet fuel demand in 2050, or 22% of the total drop-in fuel demand if you include renewable diesel and gasoline. If you add in the cheapest synthetic fuel pathway, which is scenario E, which uses bioflue CO2 and blue hydrogen, you could meet up to 90% of total jet fuel demand in BC with low carbon SAF, or just under 60% of the total drop-in fuel demand. The rest of this demand, to meet the rest of the demand for drop-in fuels, you would need to meet that with either first-generation biofuels imported from elsewhere in Canada or internationally, or higher cost pathways using dead wood or fire-killed wood, or direct air capture CO2. So that's the theoretical picture using energy system modeling and techno-economic literature. But what would it actually take to build one of these facilities in BC? Next slide, please. So in order to move from a more academic techno-economic literature review analysis of this pathway to a more real-world perspective, we did some additional engagement with industry to look more closely at the actual component systems required and their costs. We also looked at practical aspects like production ramp-up, first-of-a-kind cost penalties, risk premiums, and financing instruments, including the credits available from the BC Low Carbon Fuel Standard and the federal clean fuel regulations. Next slide. The reason that this matters is that the industry-informed adjustments we made to our financial modeling nearly doubled our capital cost estimate, as you'll see on the next slide, and this has some important policy implications. Next slide. We built a simplified project developer financial model for a theoretical BTL facility that is optimized for SAF production, meaning that the output slate of the process is tuned to produce about 65% SAF, 20% renewable naphtha, and 15% renewable diesel. You can see in the stacked bar chart on the lower left that once we included the industry feedback for things like reactor cost, winterization, and first-of-a-kind premiums, the total capital investment for the facility increased from literature values by about 90%, from 146 million to a more realistic 281 million. This also increased the cost of production to $2.85 a liter, or about 3.5 to 4x the historical wholesale pricing of diesel and jet fuel. On the right, you can see some of the key assumptions that we used for this case study. We ran model iterations to achieve an internal rate of return, or IRR, of 20%. This was based on industry feedback. For a first-of-a-kind project like this, investors will be looking for a higher rate of return than the typical 8 to 12% that they could get from mature infrastructure or lower risk project equity investments. We ended up choosing a CapEx grant as a way to bridge the cost gap between the production costs and a weighted average market price for the fossil fuel equivalent of the facility output. Next slide. As you can see on the figure on the left, the credits available from the BC LCFS and the CFR are essential in bridging that cost gap between the product price, which is the sale price required to meet the risk-adjusted investment targets, and the fossil equivalents of the facility output. The CapEx grant was then added to meet the remainder of the cost gap to achieve that 20% IRR. On the figure on the right, you can see a sensitivity analysis on the effect of key parameters on the rate of return. It's important to point out that the top 3 risks to the project are all external to the project: credit pricing, price of hydrogen, in this case, which includes natural gas costs and carbon capture and sequestration costs, and the offtake price. It's also interesting to note that the cost of the feedstock itself doesn't have a large impact on the rate of return, but rather the security of the feedstock supply does. So if you look at utilized capacity, which is 3 up from the bottom, It shows that if your feedstock supply isn't reliable or stable and your production capacity drops, it can have a very large impact on project viability. A final key takeaway from this analysis is that even after the capital is repaid, stable long-term credit values are required to maintain plant profitability. Policy continuity is essential. We point out in the report that if the BC LCFS were scrapped, that this would essentially kneecap any chances of building out a drop-in fuel industry in BC. Next slide. Another real-world aspect to consider when thinking about first-of-a-kind projects is the effect that project startup delays and ramp-up rates can have on project viability. Construction or permitting delays are represented on the left panel, and the ramp-up delays due to technology integration issues, for example, are in the right panel. We spoke with one potential biomass to liquids developer that decided not to pursue a project in BC because they were told that the environmental permitting process could take 4 years. And although BC has recently taken action to make permitting processes easier and more streamlined for renewable energy projects, I don't think that a first-of-a-kind drop-in fuel production facility would directly benefit at this point from these regulatory updates. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now, how can we scale up drop-in fuel production in BC and go from first-of-a-kind to nth-of-a-kind facilities? For this exercise, we looked at how could we meet all of the projected jet fuel demand in BC by 2050 with sustainable aviation fuel produced from biomass to liquids facilities. And then the next question is, what is the scale of resources required and investment required to achieve this? In the left panel, you can see that we applied S-curve dynamics to backcast from 2050 demand for sustainable aviation fuel to an intermediate 2035 target of 450 million liters per year. And this would be about 15% of the jet fuel supply, which is an ambitious target as the BC LCFS currently has a 3% renewable content target for 2030 for jet fuel. In the right panel, you can see the capital requirements to meet this target. The important thing to highlight here is that to reach the 2035 interim target of 15% of BC's jet fuel demand with sustainable aviation fuel, it would require about 5 first-of-a-kind facilities at that 44 million liters per year total output and 3 commercial-scale facilities with double that output at full-scale capacity operating within 10 years. Cumulative capital investment would be about $5.5 billion with cumulative CapEx grants of $600 million over 10 years. But by 2036, the CapEx grant requirement would go to 0 due to learning effects and scaling effects. And also, CapEx grants are just one way we chose to meet the financial targets. We also give examples in the report of how offtake price guarantees and SAF mandates could also be used to meet the same bankability hurdle. Next slide. One of the important things to consider when thinking about scaling up drop-in fuel production in BC is the sheer scale of resources that could be required. So instead of the world we're in now, where you have a quite respectable 30% renewable diesel in your diesel pool in BC and essentially 0% SAF in your jet pool, the world in which you have 100% renewable diesel fuel pool and 100% SAF jet fuel pool, the resource requirements are much more significant. For example, to meet the demand for jet fuel in BC in 2050, it could require 10 million dry tons of biomass residues. And for context, that's about 50% of BC's total roundwood harvest in 2023. If you were using blue hydrogen to maximize your carbon efficiency of these systems, it would require the equivalent of 20% of Canada's current annual hydrogen production, coupled with about 5% of Northeast BC's estimated CO2 storage capacity. If you were to use green hydrogen to produce your fuel, that would be the equivalent of new clean power representing about 70% of BC's 2023 electricity generation and about 1% of current industrial water use. All of this is to say that there are large-scale infrastructure implications and industrial policy considerations at play here when considering scaling up drop-in fuels. Next slide. We also tried to imagine what scaling up drop-in fuels in BC would look like from an integrated value chain perspective. What new industries are required and how would they be integrated? One of the key things to consider is having new dedicated hydrogen pipelines and CO2 sequestration pipelines that could be shared across industries. Northeast BC, oh, someone just laughed. Hopefully it's at the joke at the top here. Northeast BC is where the majority of the sequestration geology is in BC, and a lot of the demand for hydrogen and CO2 sequestration is farther south along existing natural gas pipeline infrastructure. The value chain for drop-in fuels in BC isn't about just one or two facilities, it's about building shared infrastructure. I mentioned hydrogen and carbon sequestration infrastructure, but there may also be the need to build biohubs to manage the seasonality and variability of biomass feedstock supply, which would also benefit BC's emerging bioeconomy. There may also be dedicated biorefineries that need to be built to convert the biocrude outputs of multiple facilities into saleable fuels instead of each facility requiring its own on-site refining infrastructure. Okay, next slide, please. So the key takeaways from this study. Next slide. So even with major electrification and efficiency gains, we've established that BC could still need up to 8 billion liters of drop-in fuels every year by 2050, mainly for aviation, for heavy-duty transport, some marine, and some industrial applications. We've also established that BC has substantial biomass potential, but only a small portion of it is near zero global warming potential. So detailed carbon accounting, feedstock validation, and best use principles should apply here. We've determined that the strongest near-term drop-in fuel production pathway is probably biomass to liquids. And also, first-of-a-kind projects are not bankable on market terms alone. They need public de-risking, stable credit values, and revenue certainty. And this will help validate technologies and build supply chains and attract investors. So scaling is possible, but it will require coordinated policy and infrastructure. Hydrogen, carbon capture, and clean power infrastructure at scale overlap with industrial policy and are shareable across sectors. And very importantly, social license is a core condition for this. So public trust, the idea that of converting forests into fuels, taking whole trees and converting it into fuel, being very clear that that's not what this is about. Indigenous partnerships, extremely important, and forestry sector alignment. And we have two nice full-page features in the report on two of the first biomass to liquids projects in Canada that have very strong Indigenous partnerships. One is the Slash to SAF initiative in Prince George with Arbios Biotech and the LTFN. And another project is one that just reached FID recently this fall in Fort Francis in Northwest Ontario. That is Highberry Energy, which is a BC-based company, and the WBCEC, I think 51% owners, is a consortium of 10 to 12 Indigenous communities. Next slide. So looking at the economic competitiveness factors here, we need to have funding tools and bankable credits match project realities. So some feedback from industry suggests that pioneer plants and demos could benefit more from direct grants or contracts for difference for offtake than from investment tax credits. Number two, competitiveness against fossil fuel incumbents. This is, these dynamics are currently in flux, but the consumer-facing carbon tax getting scrapped hurts already challenged drop-in fuel economics versus fossil fuels. But recent fossil fuel price volatility highlights the energy diversity and security concerns. And this could potentially benefit, producing your own fuels in your own province. The CFR and BCLCFS credit market stability is a critical factor, as we've mentioned, for long-term plant economics. And there's another factor at play here is that the US, even though it seems to be scrapping most climate-related initiatives, it's not backing down on the drop-in fuel sector. The 45Z clean fuel production tax credits have been extended through 2029 with favorable factors for drop-in fuel production in the US from crop oils. Although they did scrap their 1.75x SAF multiplier. So this could be an opportunity for Canada and BC to take the lead on sustainable aviation fuel. Next slide. Okay, finally, before I hand it back over to Ashley for questions, I would like to mention something about how the main report is structured. It starts off with a roadmap in table form that we've called Options for DIF Development in BC. This was done intentionally. We wanted the study to be more than a body of evidence. We wanted it to be useful and actionable. So rather than burying the action plan or action items at the end of the report, we've pulled the tangible takeaways forward to start the report and organize them around four main audiences: investors, project developers, government/policymakers, and Indigenous partners. Each section speaks directly to the specific challenges, goals, and options available for scaling up low carbon drop-in fuels in BC. I also want to point out that there are a couple of maps in the report that highlight the main resource requirements and the potential siting locations for biomass to liquids, but also power to liquids facilities in BC. Hopefully that was just around 20 minutes. So thank you very much for your time and attention. And with that, I will hand it back over to Ashley for questions. And again, thanks to the entire project team that helped us get here. Thanks.
Amazing. Thanks so much for walking us through the findings, Dr. Layzell and Nathan. Dr. Layzell, if you want to keep your camera on with Nathan, we're now going to move into the Q&A portion. So I've seen some questions rolling in to the Q&A function. I've seen a few kind of rogue questions coming into the chat. So just as a reminder, please use the Q&A function and we can get started and work our way through these. We do have a decent amount of time here. So I'll just start at the top. There's a question that I think was going all the way back to Dr. Layzell when you were presenting kind of the feedstocks and the different fuel types graph. There's a question that says, it looks like bunker fuel is absent from the model. Is that because those emissions are not included in BC's inventory boundaries? Or do you have an idea of the magnitude of maritime sector emissions for ships calling at BC ports? So I think kind of commenting on the different fuel types and also the implications for the marine sector.
Certainly, I can comment on that. We did include we certainly had heavy fuel oil in our analysis, and some of that is the bunker fuels that would be used probably more for domestic maritime activities, not the bunker fuels. Essentially, we use the Comprehensive Energy Use Database for the province of British Columbia, and I do not think that includes the bunker fuel for ships leaving the province going, say, to China or whatever. So, in the analysis, I think the analysis, I was just looking that up. Heavy fuel oil was less than it's about 0.1% of the energy content of all of the end use fuels. So it's not a big contributor. So that's why we hadn't highlighted it. The big ones were gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, natural gas, which tend to be in the range of, I guess jet fuel is around 8 to 9%. The other one's about 17 or 18% each of the overall fuels.
Great. And a question just popped in the bottom that's sort of related, asking, what about non-drop-in fuels like e-methanol for maritime decarbonization? Do you want to maybe just speak to the parameters of the scope and a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so one of the things we decided at the start to look at, certainly methanol or it could be used, and we're not really a drop-in fuel in some ways because you can't, at least to my knowledge, you could use it as a mix. But as a question of whether an existing engine technology, I think the real thing for drop-in fuels we're looking at is using existing conversion technologies so we don't have to modify the engines. And that actually has a great advantage, of course, for the transition. It allows you to not have to change the infrastructure as much as you would for, say, moving to electricity or hydrogen.
But
So
we do
the
discuss that in the report, though. In the main report, there's a section
mm,
on marine decarbonization and the different fuel options available, and even there's something like 364 dual fuel methanol ships on order. But I don't think anyone's currently fueling with with e-methanol.
and what I think is the question that really has to be looked at there in some ways is where are you getting the carbon from for the methanol? And if
Mhm.
it's e-methanol, you're pulling it from the atmosphere. The economics of that becomes challenging. And in some ways, we were looking at that as looking at renewable natural gas, where you're pulling it from there and making RNG, or essentially natural gas and e-methanol, methane. And the economics is very challenging with that. So we've done other work more on the hydrogen side, looking at ammonia as an opportunity as well. But that would not be considered really a drop-in fuel. That's more of an alternative ammonia, of a hydrogen alternative end use fuel. So I mean, you could argue. I'm not sure the adding e-methanol would change our conclusions very much. It would be because it's all follow the carbon. Where's the carbon coming from? And the cost of that, getting that carbon and making it into fuel is going to be pretty challenging to make it economic.
Absolutely. It's all about the carbon story. And I think there was another question that was coming in when Nathan was chatting through the different pathways and the addition of hydrogen, asking, is the discarded carbon biochar? So maybe just talking a little bit more about those processes and what the discarded carbon embodies.
Nathan, do you want to answer that, or do you want me
Sure,
to?
I can do it. Mainly in this case, you're doing a water gas shift reaction to essentially produce CO2, and it leaves the system that way. But again, there's another interesting point here is that, producing in BC with the, low carbon intensity of the grid and a lot of forest residues, the carbon intensity of the fuels you could potentially produce is quite low, 10 to 14 grams of CO2 per megajoule. And because the gas cleaning stage of when you're gasifying the biomass, you're cleaning up the syngas before you make a liquid fuel out of it. During that stage, part of the process is collecting and sort of concentrating CO2 and removing it from the system. So you have a natural, almost, I think the estimates I've heard are 10 times cheaper sort of carbon capture um, process happening. And if that CO2 that's captured from the gas cleaning step is sequestered, you can also have a negative carbon intensity fuel, which is two groups that we spoke with looking at doing this in Canada are both investigating adding that carbon capture step to have, a negative carbon intensity fuel, which is very interesting.
Yeah, and again, I think that carbon intensity piece is really the core. And there's a question here around which forest residues are GWP zero and which are excluded. So can you just double down on kind of why the selection of the specific residual forestry resources were selected from that carbon intensity perspective?
Certainly, I can comment on that. The one that was certainly selected and carried throughout was flue gas of biomass processing plants or food processing plants or alcohol making plants, for example, that are using biomass feedstocks. And the CO2 coming up the chimney and going into the atmosphere is not currently counted as a greenhouse gas. So capturing that and making that into a drop-in fuel would be considered fine. All of the slash burning that occurs in the province of British Columbia, and there's a lot, many millions of tons per year of forest slash that is burnt on site. That goes to the atmosphere right away. So clearly diverting that away from slash burning and converting it into a drop-in fuel would be a zero. In fact, actually, it could even have other benefits because you would have other benefits of being able to avoid, say, methane emissions that occurs in some of the slash burning. These wood pellets is another one. I think we also looked at some possibility of forest residues, and especially if the forest residues were combined with forest management practices that regrow the forest faster. So removing the residues would actually allow for a faster regrowth of the forest. And we were relying a lot on studies that have been done and published in literature for areas like British Columbia and North Temperate regions where forest management practices basically would stimulate the regrowth of the forest in a way that would actually offset essentially the removal of the biomass and diverting it to diff production. But it comes down to once you start seeing biomass stocks, which would last for many decades on the forest floor, and putting that into the atmosphere right away, carries with it a pretty large greenhouse gas penalty. And that's the kind of feedstocks that we tend to think that it would be hard to justify taking those feedstocks and claiming climate change benefit.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. There's kind of two camps of questions coming in, one a little bit more focused on the tech and drop-in fuel side, and another more focused on the policy and permitting side. So I think we'll kind of just stick to the technical side first. So there's two questions here, kind of around the conversion technology platform. So one is fast pyrolysis and HTL at more recent biomass conversion technology platforms. Maybe have distinct advantages over wood gasification routes, for example. I think the question is likely around the different available technologies to date and why the focus was on some of them. So we do have a heat map for some of the current TRLs within the study, but maybe Dr. Layzell and Nathan, if you want to comment on the conversion pathways for production.
I'll leave that with you, Nathan.
So the question is, why did we focus on gasification and not fast pyrolysis or HTL?
Yes.
Well, it's a good question because yes, there is an HTL facility in BC. It will potentially be the largest in the world once it scales up, if it does scale up. Some of the feedback that we had is that it is lower TRL still than gasification. Plus Fischer-Tropsch. And again, there's almost an emerging trend of looking at biomass to liquids and power to liquids, using the Fischer-Tropsch, the gas to liquid sort of fuel pathway and getting syngas either from biomass or from captured CO2 plus hydrogen. I think Europe's relying on it a lot to make sustainable aviation fuel for the future of their sort of decarbonization plans. So that was one reason, is that we wanted to look at we wanted to look at synthetic fuels and biomass together, and looking at the TRLs and getting feedback from our workshops. It seemed to be that in BC, there's also a history of gasification. There's multiple gasifiers running currently in BC. A couple of companies that are potentially doing gasification projects in BC. Fast pyrolysis, also a lot of potential. You can get biochar, you can have industrial heating that can be shared, and also have syngas that can be converted to RNG. I think there's a project in Ontario doing that. Again, I think it comes down to maybe just being lower TRL, and looking at specifically at liquid fuels, the pyrolysis bio oil. Some feedback we got is that it's harder to make saleable transport fuels out of it than it is like a Fischer-Tropsch crude.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of segue into the other piece of the value chain here. So in terms of conversion technologies, the focus is pretty clear. The end use focus in the report is relatively clear as well. A lot of focus on SAF. There's a kind of argument here that that's a longer time frame fuel, and strictest fuel mandates to meet other fuel markets, such as industrial heating fuels, marine fuels, might be more near term. Do you want to talk a bit about why the focus on SAF and really the potential there?
Maybe I can
Hey,
comment first if you like, and then pass it over to Nathan. One of the things on heating fuels is we're used to paying, we use natural gas as a heating fuel, and in Alberta it's like $2 to $3 a gigajoule. In BC, what you might be $4 or $5 a gigajoule, something like that. And the incremental cost you'd have to pay for a low carbon. There's, I think one of the first charts that Nathan had was more than 10 times the price. And so there's a real premium one has to pay. And the amount of dollars per ton of CO2 diverted is quite high, given the fact that we typically pay so little for heating fuels. In terms of, I think what the real issue was, uh, there are other um, decarbonization alternatives to things like diesel fuel and heavy duty transport. The SAF challenge is particularly challenging. There's really not. It's hard to see long distance airplane flights running on electricity directly. Batteries and it's hydrogen is going to be many, many decades away. I think it may be the ultimate net zero choice for sustainable aviation fuels, but it could be many, many decades away. So SAF was one area where they seemed to be the industry was particularly interested and willing to pay a premium for those SAF fuels. Whether one can also find the same, I think there's some interesting opportunity on marine fuels, especially in BC, because those engines can take just lots of different crap and run on it. So that one is an interesting model, but it ended up being a little different sort of technology pathways than ones that we were looking at for real drop-in fuels.
Fantastic. And we just have a couple minutes left here. So super quickly, can you just comment on the if there are any assumptions made on the future of the LCFS targets or future credit prices, and maybe tie in a little bit about like permitting incentives and the policy side that can then move this forward?
yeah, okay. We did assume, well, we didn't, we have I think a 50% sensitivity, plus or minus, on the credit prices for both the LCFS assumptions that we used and the CFR. But we used kind of the average values from 2024, I think, which, probably isn't accurate if you're looking at the future. The BC credits were quite high then, and the CFR are low, but, likely that will stabilize the BC credits being lower, maybe 150 a ton, and then the federal ones being up at 300. But I think our sensitivity analysis probably captured the next 5 to 10 years of volatility. And then as far as policy, specifically, what was the question here? I'm trying to find, there's a bunch of questions.
I think that just permitting can be a big barrier. So what are the other incentives that can move folk to?
I don't know. That's a hard one. Like I mentioned, we did talk to someone who decided to try elsewhere because they were told, instead of 4 years, we'll do it in 6 months. So there might have to be a sort of, if BC wants to scale this industry, there may have to be some sort of policy suite, some sort of white gloves approach where things are laid out a bit easier upfront, so that people know what they're getting into. There's some, maybe a pledge to, it's going to be 2 years max. I don't know. But yeah, there's a lot of work that could be done on the government side to get these projects moving.
Yeah, I think that really ties well into the options plan that you can find at the beginning of the report, where there are quite a few of tangible actions to take away. Unfortunately, we have hit time. I know there's a few questions that we didn't get to. If you're curious about learning more, or if you want to kind of connect separately, I'm just adding the website page into the chat that has the reports linked there, even though I'm sure you've all already read them, and the info email for NorthX in case you're looking to connect with us. I just want to thank Dave, Nathan, and the team so much for this wonderful presentation. So much information synthesized into a really short time frame. Thank you to you and the team again for your outstanding work on the analysis and for taking the time to break it down for the audience and answer questions today. We're just really proud to have collaborated on such a comprehensive report that can serve as the foundation for further research, innovation, and investment to scale drop-in fuels. And thanks to everyone who joined us, submitted questions, engaged. Your perspectives really matter, and they'll continue to inform how we think about drop-in fuels in the space. In terms of staying connected, if you're working on a drop-in fuels project with impact in BC, we would love to hear from you at NorthX. And you can just email us using the email. Stay tuned. This is just the beginning of NorthX's involvement in low carbon drop-in fuels. We really appreciate it. Thanks so much for being here, and we'll chat with you soon. Have a fantastic day.